Is there something about the haunted stories associated with railroad stations, museums, and the trains themselves? What is it about the railroads and trains that make them a great recipe for hauntings? Is it the rich history and their heritage as a key part of the Industrial Revolution and the many tragic deaths that took place during the building of the railroads? And what is it about battlefields and wars that create hauntings? Is it the tragic and sudden loss of death during large battles that creates a strong residual energy that lingers on? Author and writer Matthew Swayne joins me to share some stories from his Haunted Rails and Haunted World War II books. Well, greetings and welcome once again, fellow truth seekers, to Passion for the Paranormal, bringing a passion for the paranormal to you. I'm your host, Curry Stegan, and it's wonderful to be back here with you once again for another great episode. And tonight I've got Matthew Swayne joining me once again on the show. And first time I had Matthew on the show, he talked about haunted rock and roll. And this time he's here to talk to me about haunted rails and haunted World War II. So a couple other books he's written on interesting and fascinating haunted stories. So excited to have Matthew on the show with me. And if you haven't been over to the website, please pay us a visit there at passion, the number 4, theparanormal.com. And there you can catch up with some past episodes. You can sign up to receive the Passion for the Paranormal newsletter. And just understand we're not going to share your email with anybody. It's just going to be simply to receive the newsletter. And you can also catch up with some past episodes there. So hope you'll visit the website. And if you haven't visited us on Facebook, visit us at facebook.com/passion, the number 4, the paranormal. And make sure you like and follow us there. If you're a Apple Podcast listener, please take time to just give us a quick rate and review of the show. Would really appreciate that. If you know of any family members, coworkers, friends you think that would like to tune into the show, please share a link with them. And that's going to really help us to grow the show and keep it moving forward. All right, so without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get into this discussion with Matthew. I'm really excited to have him back on the show. He's a great writer and really has some interesting stories he's written about, haunted stories. So we'll go ahead and get in this discussion with him, and be safe, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning into the show. Okay, so my guest tonight is Matthew Swayne, and Matthew is a journalist who currently works as a research writer at Penn State. Matt has worked as a reporter and as a music reviewer for several newspapers and online outlets. He is the author of several books to include his Haunted series, Haunted Rock and Roll, Haunted Rails, and Haunted World War II. Matthew, welcome back to the show, and thanks for joining me.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's always a good sign when you get an ask back, so it makes me feel like maybe, I didn't screw up too bad the last time.
No, we had a great discussion last time. We talked about haunted rock and roll, and there was really some truly amazing stories in that. I think we're going to talk a little bit here about haunted rails and haunted trains, and we'll see how time goes. And if time permits, we might get into a few stories on your Haunted World War II book as well.
That sounds great.
Yeah, I think that'd be fun to have some discussion about that. But before we get into any of the stories, maybe if you could take us back to kind of what prompted you to write this book and maybe the Haunted World War II book.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, when I talked to you before, I sort of filled you in on my journey, which is really, I was born on Halloween. And, I think just being born on that holiday gave me an appreciation of the weird and unusual and the supernatural. And as I was a reporter for a local paper in Tyrone, Pennsylvania, I started to write about ghost lore. I wrote one article really about ghost lore, and the reaction was so great that I decided that I would look into it as sort of a hobby kind of passion. I would start writing about it and collecting stories. And that led me to a book about haunted universities. And then from there, I really loved music history. So I got into haunted rock and roll and ghost country music. And then I did a follow-up of haunted rock and roll, more haunted rock and roll. And then from there, I found that the way that I approach these stories is I take something that I really like to research, and I am into history, and then I try to couple it with the supernatural, the ghost lores, and stories from paranormal researchers and things like that. So I've always been into military history, so I worked on the Haunted World War II. And then this Haunted Rails one actually has been kind of fermenting for many, many years. And it started because I was born in Tyrone, Pennsylvania, which is about 20 miles away from Altoona. And Altoona is really a railroad hub. It was, arguably the railroad capital of definitely of Pennsylvania, maybe even at certain times in the East Coast. It was known for the railroad, and really the railroad made my town, made Altoona. And the other thing that I noticed was that there were all these stories, which I would consider ghost lore, of the railroad tracks leading to Tyrone and out of Tyrone. In Altoona, I knew some ghost stories, and so I had this kind of love and appreciation of railroad history. So just taking it one step and seeing, well, there's these ghost stories about the railroad in my hometown. Wonder if there are other stories. Wonder if there's a pattern. And, as I investigated this and researched it, I found that absolutely there seems to be these ghost stories about railroad all over the country and, in fact, the world. And I also found that, a lot of these stories are coupled with tales of heroism of these railroad workers and some of the terrible accidents. And so that became the volume of how this thing created and evolved from just really an idea and an observation into this volume.
Yeah, and haunted rail stations, there's certainly a lot of history behind them, and it would certainly make sense that there'd be a lot of stories and maybe even legends behind them, if you will. You may have already kind of answered this in what you just talked about in the intro there, but why do you feel, Matthew, that there is so many stories? It seems like there's a lot of ghostly stories behind, trains and haunted, and rail stations. Why do you think they are so attractive for ghost stories?
Yeah, see, I think that is the key question. And that's the question. Sometimes I don't really talk about them when I'm writing these stories. I want these stories to be entertaining. I want these stories to make you think. But all the while that I'm writing these, I'm thinking about those questions. And for me, right out of the gate, railroading is a dangerous business. In fact, I kind of start the book out on a gloomy note, telling people, to be very, very careful when investigating these railroad stories, because the reason there's so many railroad ghost stories is because a lot of people died on the railroad. It was a dangerous business. And what I neglected to mention was that my grandfather was a engineer, and his father was an engineer. So I come from a kind of this line of railroaders. My nephew works on the railroad. And when I remember distinctly going to my grandfather's house and looking at his union magazines, and there were always these advertisements for prosthetics for legs and arms, and you got a sense that just how incredibly dangerous the railroad was. So I think that's one of the reasons. The other thing is, I think there were a lot of heroic acts kind of in line with that danger that I think ghost stories are a natural way to preserve some of these acts. Now, the third one, I'm going to kind of, pun completely intended, go off the rails on this a little bit. But, when we talked about the ghosts of rock and roll, and what you notice is that almost all of these ghost stories are accompanied by some type of shift in consciousness. Like music shifts someone, and it shifts you into a kind of another state. And so, that has been my premise writing about all of these. When I wrote about World War II, I think about how the sheer terror, the horror of war causes a shift in consciousness that I think either makes you more susceptible to these ghost stories or more open to these ghost stories, or there's some type of consciousness underlying that. So I get to haunted rails, and I think, okay, this is where the theory ends, because there doesn't seem to be that. But the more I looked into it, the more that I found that railroads were a profound shift in our consciousness as a nation, as a world. First of all, it really altered time and space. At one point, it would take you a day to get across the state. Now, all of a sudden, you can get across the country in a few days. People, when they left to go out west, never saw their family again. It was highly unlikely that they were going to see them. Now, suddenly, that changes. So it shifts consciousness. The other thing is the railroad became so important to the economy that I think that, too, added to this idea that there was something special about the railroad. And then if you look at how integrated the railroad became to kind of some of these spiritual motifs, like you think about death as, you're going into a station, and a destination, you have this. So those are some of the reasons why I think that we have these ghost stories. Some of, at least the two of them, I think, match up with pretty much all the other literature out there. But, this idea of this shift in consciousness might be a little wacky for someone, but I really feel there's something to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the Industrial Revolution and the whole the building of the railroad network across the United States, that was a big part of that Industrial Revolution. And there's just so much history behind it. Like you said, a lot of tragic deaths, that sort of thing. To me, that kind of does seem to be a recipe for, potentially for hauntings. And it's quite interesting. We have one here in Ogden, Utah. There's a lot of, stories and a lot of death behind it, and it's quite interesting. Yeah, but it certainly makes sense that there would be some potential recipes for hauntings with trains and rail stations and all the history behind that. Maybe, Matthew, if you could talk to us a little bit. I know you cover a lot of different stories in the book, but maybe if you could start us off by either one of your favorite locations and stories behind it, either one of your favorite locations or one of the favorite stories that you actually cover in this book.
Sure. The interesting thing is when I wrote the book, I found two towns that, first of all, you find that these ghost stories are spread pretty much throughout the United States. All these little towns and all these cities have their ghost stories that revolve around the railroad. But the two cities that really stood out for me, the one was Ogden and the other was Altoona. And so I did talk a little bit about some of those Ogden hauntings in the book. Now, as far as one of my favorite stories, I think one of the favorite stories I have, and it might be just because of sentimental reasons, because I live so close to Altoona, but the Railroaders Memorial Museum in Altoona is on record as being exceptionally haunted place. And one of my favorite stories, because I look at it as there's ghost lore, which is folklore, and then there are ghost stories or accounts of supernatural. Now, sometimes they can blend, and it's hard to tease out which is which. The ghost lore usually doesn't have a witness. These ghost accounts tend to have them, and that's why I think the one story in Altoona, the Railroaders Memorial Museum, was interesting to me because it really talks about this finance director who he was one of these guys that I think he was a volunteer or a worker there who would come in early and stay late. And he did that. That was his routine. He usually was the last one to leave the building. And if you know anything about the Railroaders Memorial Museum, it's a beautiful building, but it kind of has a vibe to it. It kind of has, some spookiness about it. I don't know whether he felt that in any way, but what I do know is that he left this is the account that he gave. He left work one day, one evening, and he was on the fourth floor. And so he went to the elevator, and he jumped in the elevator, as he's done hundreds of times before. But this time when he gets in, he's shocked because there's someone else in the elevator. This person has his back turned towards the finance director. And the finance director said he was a little bit stunned, stopped, and then this apparition slowly turned to face him, smiled, and then disappeared. So this is an account of someone who has experienced something. Now, usually people will kind of think that other people will make fun of them so they don't talk about it. But apparently, from what I've come to understand, is that people are so open in this museum with these accounts that he went and talked to some other people. So they took him to a room where there are all these pictures and photographs of some of these old railroad workers, and they asked him to point out the person that he saw in that elevator. And he went over and pointed at one figure in particular in a picture, and everyone agreed that that was the main suspect in some of these hauntings, and it became known as the Ghost of Frank that haunts Railroaders Memorial Museum. That's kind of one of my favorite stories in the book.
Interesting. Now, you also mentioned Ogden. Of course, here I am, Ogden, Utah, so I thought it was pretty interesting that you mentioned that. We've got Union Station here, just not far from where I live. I'm a paranormal investigator, done investigations there. And I can say that it is an interesting place. But why did you mention Ogden? What was it about this location here that interested you and made you want to write about it?
Well, and again, so when I start exploring outside of my own, kind of sphere of influence, I rely on a lot of people like you who are investigating and putting out information about these hauntings. And for some reason, I found a lot of stories about Ogden, Utah, and the ghost there. And the one in Ogden, the Ogden Union Station, I think you mentioned that you investigated that. That was interesting to me. I think that ghost is also known as Frank. So maybe that's a kind of a coincidence there. But there were other stories about haunted areas related to the railroad there, and they were just kind of scattered all over the place. So that's why I was attracted to that. And I think, have you ever investigated the Ogden Exchange Building?
Well, I actually never did get the opportunity to. I know other people that did. It is no longer open to paranormal investigators, and as I understand it, I think that building is going to be tore down.
That's too bad. Well, that was another one that came up, and so that's how I got. That's how Ogden kind of made it on the map, so to speak, for haunted railroad.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've got historic 25th Street, which is right where the train station is. There was a lot of history, a lot of underground gambling, bootlegging, all that kind of stuff going on in the early 1900s. So much history there, and really was glad I got the opportunity to investigate down there. In the book, you talk about the Civil War era rebel ghost train. That sounds like an interesting one. Can you talk a little bit about that one?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, and I think that is in West Point, West Virginia, I believe. Now, this is a story of that really blends fact and fiction and ghost lore and ghost accounts all together. But there is a story that there was a train that was ferrying, in some accounts, it was ferrying rebel soldiers to the front. In others, it was ferrying the wounded back to Richmond, I think. And allegedly, nobody really knows for sure what happened, but allegedly the train was either attacked by the Union, who captured it, or they burned it down. And ever since then, there have been these stories along that rail of either, in some accounts, a ghost train. In other accounts, they'll talk about the ghosts of these soldiers or these wounded soldiers. And in some cases, it's coupled with this what is a major phenomena in haunted rails is these ghostly orbs that are seen on near railroad tracks, and that's another one. So it's got this part of it is like this ghost train, part of it's these ghostly orbs that are either described as the spirits of people, or maybe a lantern being held by a ghost. So that's the story with that one.
Interesting. And then you also cover a chapter on the Abraham Lincoln ghost train. Can you talk a little bit about that and any of the stories associated with it?
Yeah, that's another really interesting story that I would say is pretty much purely ghost lore, purely folklore. But I included it in the book. First of all, I include ghost lore in the book. I think it's fascinating. Second of all, it's just such an evocative story when you really get into the history behind it. And if your listeners don't know what the ghost train is, for the Abraham Lincoln ghost train, it all starts actually before the Civil War, when Abraham Lincoln was on his way to inauguration. They kind of took him on this victory lap through the northern states, through really the heartland of the people that voted him into office. So I think it starts in Illinois, it goes to Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania. I think New York is there, Maryland, eventually, and I'm probably showing my lack of understanding of American geography through that description. But in any event, they finally get to Washington, D.C., and it was quite the story about this victory train. So during the war, and especially towards the end, where it looked like the Union would prevail, some of Abraham Lincoln's associates wanted another victory train ride. This would be reversing the path that he took on his inauguration. So they really had this all planned out. They had a train that would take him. I think it was to Nashville, but I'm not totally sure on that. But of course, tragically, he was struck down. He was assassinated. And so this victory train suddenly becomes a very sad event in American history, which became the Abraham Lincoln funeral train. It still took the same path that the victory train ride was going to take, but it had completely different overtones to it. Now, this was a pivotal moment in American history, but years later, in fact, this ghost story came up that if you go out on the path that Abraham Lincoln took shortly after his assassination, and you're on one of these rail lines, you will see the funeral train of Abraham Lincoln. It's a ghost train. And I talk a little bit about this in Haunted World War II, and it fascinates me. Maybe everyone else knew this, but I tend to think of ghosts as human beings who passed on. But sometimes some of these objects themselves can be haunted. They can be ghosts themselves. And in this case, the entire train is a ghost. But the account goes, if you're standing there on the anniversary along this path, that this train will come through, and you'll initially hear it, and smoke will pour out of the smokestacks. And in fact, some people say that flames fly out of it. And as the train slowly passes you, the other thing that they talk about in a lot of these stories is that time seems to stand still. But as it passes by, if you look into the train, people say that you can see the casket surrounded by, in some of the stories, the ghosts of Union soldiers, and it's skeletons that are surrounding the casket, draped in the Union red, white, and blue. And then it passes into the night, and suddenly the clouds go past the moon, and everything is lit up, and time seems to get back on track. Another pun there for you. So it's a really interesting story, and of course I spent some time trying to find people who might have seen it for real, and I never really got anyone who said that they've seen this ghost train of Abraham Lincoln. There are some accounts, people will write about it and blog. One was so interesting that I used it. But I think sometimes this is a way for people to add on to this ghost lore. I think that's what makes it so viable and makes it so organic, and that people share it because they get to add their own take to it. So that's really the story about the Abraham Lincoln funeral ghost train.
Now, Matthew, you've obviously done a lot of research on these these ghostly stories, whether it's about famous rock and rollers or trains or the World War II stories. Any of these, because some of these stories, it sounds like you had relayed to you by people that are actually doing paranormal investigating, kind of like me. Have any of them, have you been able to, I don't know, I want to use the word fact check, but maybe that's not the best word to use. Anything like you've been able to go back and do some historical research and kind of validate any of these stories that were relayed to you?
So there are several stories, and again, when I approach these stories, I do try to reach out to paranormal researchers because they do have actual accounts. So in this book, you'll find a few of those researchers have talked to me and interviewed me, and I've interviewed them about their accounts. And some of the things that they experienced jibe with the ghost lore. I'm thinking of some of the paranormal research accounts in Altoona in the Railroaders Museum. I talked to a guy and a lady there who were kind of the official paranormal investigators of that place, and they had a lot of stories that reflected the other ghost stories. So some of it has been, verified and corroborated, I think would be a good term for it. Now, it's one of those things where I always caution people that one of the reasons I think we have ghost stories is to preserve history. What you find is that these ghost stories aren't perfect history, but a lot of the ghost stories in the book reflect actual historic events. And if they don't reflect actual historic events, I think they reflect the meaning of that time. Rather than the actual facts, I think they tell a story about what it was like to live in those times, in those eras. So it's a little bit of blend of fact, fiction, and everything in between. I think I try to take a very agnostic approach to this. I just want to be a journalist who tells all the stories that I can find and kind of weave something together coherently in an entertaining fashion. But I will tell you that there has undoubtedly been people that I've interviewed for any of these books who I really feel have had some type of experience at these places or with these people that they can't explain. And I think some of the accounts, not just from the people that I've interviewed, but I use a lot of accounts from newspapers and magazines and websites. There are definitely people, when they go to the extra step of going public with this, knowing that it can cause ridicule, it really speaks to the veracity of their accounts. At least in their minds, they definitely have experienced something. I've talked to people in some of these volumes that really had their lives changed. They may have gone from being skeptics to all of a sudden believing, or at least not having so many doubts. I've had people, tell me that they've had these experiences that have changed them spiritually. Some of them wish they wouldn't have had these experiences because they were pretty content with their former philosophies. I just try to be a kind of a medium for all of these different stories and all of these different takes.
Yeah, that's an interesting take on it. You also cover other stories about haunted railroad museums and haunted railroad stations. Any others that kind of stuck out to you, other than you mentioned Altoona and Ogden? Any others that really stuck out to you that kind of either blew your mind or you just thought were really, really interesting?
I think there's the other one. There's a ghost story in Green Bay, the Railroad Museum there, and that kind of has a connection to the World War II book too. In fact, I think I may have talked about it in that one as well. But there's an actual historical fact that Dwight D. Eisenhower, when he was in England, traveled all through the UK in his own personal railroad car. And I think it was the Bayonet, maybe the Bayonet 2. But in any event, after the war, of course, this was preserved in this museum in Green Bay. And they still have stories about this railroad car being haunted. And one of the kind of the cool ones is that there was a worker who was vacuuming the carpet in this car. And about halfway through, he realized he was going to take a break, grab something to eat. So he left the job half done, and he left the vacuum cleaner plugged in, and he went to grab something to eat. And when he came back, and I believe he had the car all locked up, so there was no one else nearby, and there was probably no one else that was in the car. When he came back, the vacuum cleaner had been unplugged. It was wrapped up, and he noticed that not only was the carpet cleaned, but there were no track marks from the vacuum cleaner. And from what he later, and he did try to ask people, did you finish the job for me? But he later learned that Dwight D. Eisenhower was very fastidious, and one of his quirks was he didn't like all these track marks, footprint marks in the carpet, and he would have them kind of patted down and spread out so that you couldn't see them. So I thought that was kind of cool. And, before I end that story, I have to tell you that the real unsung heroes of haunted rails are the people and the volunteers of these museums. And likewise in the World War II book, because they really, most of them are volunteers, and they really preserve railroad history. And not only do they preserve this railroad history, but a lot of the ghost stories kind of comes from these people who have such intimate knowledge of railroad history and have such passion for the industry. And I don't think that this book really appears if it wasn't for them.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I wanted to get a little bit into this Haunted World War II book, because this sounds quite fascinating. You've got a lot of stories you cover in that as well. Let's talk a little bit about this ghost of an admiral that gives a tour of the USS Lexington. That sounds interesting.
Yeah, that's a great segue, because the USS Lexington they had all these beautiful big battleships and aircraft carriers of World War II that were really destined for the scrap heap. But these World War II historians and these military historians and these people that felt the real need to preserve this very important time in history got together, and they would create these basically museum ships. And what I found is they're not just museum ships, they've become kind of these paranormal ghost ships too. And in the one case, in what you're talking about is the USS Lexington. And there are just so many stories about the USS Lexington, which was nicknamed kind of coincidentally the Blue Ghost by the Japanese, because they thought that the USS Lexington had been sunk, and then all of a sudden, there it is. And then throughout the war, about the last thing you'd want to see as a Japanese sailor or Japanese service member was to see the USS Lexington, and it seemed to be everywhere at once. So the story is one of the more fascinating stories is that they give these tours on the USS Lexington, and the story goes a few people showed up for the one tour, and there was a guy who was dressed like a admiral or in a uniform, and he started leading them on this tour and pointing out some of the different places and the different adding some different facts about the aircraft carrier, how it was used, and everyone sort of knows he had just an unbelievable sense of this ship and knowledge about its service that they were quite impressed. And then eventually the story goes that this person that they thought was just a tour guide ended up and just disappeared, sort of like the blue ghost of the USS Lexington, was there for a minute and was gone. And so that started, that was one of the stories about this. And the other one is that there is this ghost, and maybe this admiral is a similar story, but they call him the Ghost of Charlie, which is this blonde-haired, blue-eyed sailor who will show up, give these tours, and then suddenly disappear.
Wow. And, I used to live in Corpus Christi, Texas, and that is where the USS Lexington is docked. I actually did a tour of it, a night tour, and it is very interesting. And I remember hearing a version of this story you're talking about, and I believe it was a group of Boy Scouts who were touring on the USS Lexington. I don't know if this is the same story. It sounds similar that they were getting a tour right after they arrived shortly there, and then this person just disappeared. Now, I don't remember if that was a story of an admiral. I'm not sure if we're talking about the same story here, but it sounds like a similar story.
Well, there is another story, and I think it deals with the Lexington as well, but it might be one of these other aircraft carriers. And this sounds very similar in that there was I guess the scouts would have these campouts, and they would get to eat in the canteen in the ship, and apparently they were eating at the canteen, and the person who was in charge of them told them to clean up. They cleaned up, and then he went back into the kitchen, and when he came back out, the place was just in complete disarray. And the scouts so he blamed them, but apparently the scouts had already been taken away by another tour guide, and he could never figure out how this mess happened in literally seconds when these boys were clearly under supervision away from that area. So that's very similar. And I think what happens is sometimes these stories can merge, sometimes they can kind of reflect one another. Sometimes they go all over the place. It becomes, that's the interesting thing about ghost lore. Now, when I started writing this, I thought, well, maybe this is one of those cases like Telephone, where I tell you a small story, you tell someone else, and by the end, there are all these different facts. Now, that might be, but there's another kind of way that you can analyze these. And it could be that everyone has a little bit of an experience like this. Like, how many Boy Scout troops were on this ship for a camp out? Everybody has a little detail. And so when they hear this story, they might tell it, but then they might add some of the things that happened to them. There's a natural inclination just to say, well, these stories have no merits. They're just kind of made up folk tales. But that might not be the case. They might actually be kind of a hodgepodge of incidences and experiences that get, put into these, encapsulated into these little tales.
Yeah, and it was interesting. I went on that tour. There were a lot of other stories, that, and I don't remember a lot of them, but, I did not serve in the Navy. I served in the Air Force. So if I say this incorrectly, I apologize. But I want to say it's the Bozeman's whistle. It's a kind of whistle they do on a ship or aircraft carrier. I'd heard stories that people had heard that, when there's only a few people in there. Interesting stories like that. I know there were a lot of other stories covered. I wish I could think of them, but it certainly has its fair share of haunted tales, that's for sure. And the tour was quite interesting. I was glad.
Did you pick up on anything in those during your tour?
Not anything personally I could say was paranormal, other than kind of getting the weird sensation that it feels like somebody's watching you or somebody may be present. And of course, this was before the time I actually had gotten involved in paranormal investigating, so it was just kind of a thing. And as I remembered, I think it was a Halloween night tour of the ship.
Oh my gosh! Perfect.
Yeah, so there were some stories behind it and whatnot. Some of them were probably legend, but it was kind of interesting, and it was fun to be able to. I went on the tour a couple of times. One was a day tour, and then we did that night tour. Now you cover another story in here. It is the story of a spirit sailor keeping eternal watch at Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, that's, the one thing that I think about, and it's been a while since I wrote this book. It's been a couple years, but some of these stories still linger with me, especially from Haunted World War II. Some of them are so sad, and they give you so much sense of awe, and how evocative these tales can be. It really is a little different from the haunted rock and roll. I mean, when I write about haunted rock and roll, there are some stories there I think are creepy. There are some stories that are most of the stories there are interesting, at least to me. I think there are a lot of stories in haunted rock and roll that are very tongue in cheek. Even if there are people who have had these experiences. I mean, the fact that Jim Morrison haunts a bathroom in a Mexican restaurant, I just think is one of those tales that you can kind of, have fun with, and if anything, it'll give a rise out of somebody, even if the staunchest skeptic might smile at that one. But when you deal with haunted World War II, when I started getting into this, I realized I had to approach this much more serious. And I know I'm belaboring the point, but this story about the sailor in Pearl Harbor, I think, is, again, one of these evocative tales. And the story is that there was a sailor on watch on the morning of December 7th around 6 a.m. and decided last minute he needed to go on shore. And he was keeping watch, by the way, on the USS Arizona, and decided he was going to leave his station, go on shore. And again, it was a very relaxed environment. And the story goes that as he turned around, was getting ready to come back on board or ready to go back to the ship, that's when the attack happened. And he was never there to try to help his ship, and all his friends perished. And the story is that if you go to Pearl Harbor on a foggy morning, you'll be able to see this lone figure of a sailor kind of gazing out onto the harbor where those ships were attacked, and that's the ghost story about this kind of this lone figure in Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, that's interesting. I have been on the USS Arizona tour out at Pearl Harbor. I was actually stationed there for a few years, and not at Pearl Harbor, but actually at Hickam. And I've also done a tour of the Gettysburg battlefield, and I can understand kind of what you're saying there. My sense was that you have this kind of, it's almost this eerie calm as you're walking around, and this almost like palpable energy that you can feel. And it's almost hard to explain in words, but I certainly felt it when I was at Gettysburg. It's just an energy you feel, and I don't know if that's just something your brain is coming up with. I was visualizing these big battles that they were having during Gettysburg as I was walking around the different sites. And it just kind of evokes this kind of feeling in you that it's really hard to explain, but you certainly feel that energy. And it almost feels like there's some
Absolutely.
sort of residual energy there left behind. I felt it when I went on the USS Arizona tour. And perhaps it's just these emotions you're feeling from these tragic events that happened, thousands and thousands of soldiers dying in battle like in Gettysburg, but it certainly evokes a certain kind of feeling in you, and it's interesting.
I
Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I totally agree with that. I think one of the things that these ghost stories do, even when we were talking about the ghost story of Abraham Lincoln, is that idea of freezing time, freezing history, and with this story of this sailor looking out onto the harbor, that one act, maybe he could have been the one person who alerted the crews to wake them up. You get this sense, and I have said a lot that I've never gone on a paranormal tour. I've gone to places where they're telling ghost stories, but I've never gone on a paranormal research, anything like that. And I kind of do have my reasons for that now. But I have been on the USS North Carolina. I've been on tours of the USS Yorktown. And I'll even go as far as to say that when I was in Sun Studio, I didn't see a ghost. I didn't experience anything, but it would not have surprised me. You just get this sense of the history and the importance of life changing moments in time, and that somehow it's embedded like right in the time space and you pick up on it.
Yeah. Now you also cover, and I don't remember the specifics about it, but there is a ghost story you talk about dealing with the Battle of Iwo Jima. Can you talk a little bit about what that story is about and what you talk about in the book?
Yeah, that's another one that is just super super emotional for me. And in the South Pacific, these stories are told over and over again. But remember Iwo Jima, it was basically the perfect fortress for the Japanese. It was rocky caves, great terrain to defend, and the Americans went in there, and it was a real slugfest, and always has been described as kind of a hell on earth. And people talk about just the smell of Iwo Jima being this kind of smelled like hell, smelled like sulfur. That comes up a lot, and the other thing about Iwo Jima is that most of the soldiers, in fact, I don't know whether any of the Japanese soldiers surrendered. They all died there. And since then, it's been an extremely haunted spot. And one of the stories that I'm thinking about, and there are really quite a few stories about the ghost of Iwo Jima, but there's one story that was written about in a magazine, and it talks about this one. I think he was a military contractor he had a place on Iwo Jima, but he was frequently flying back to the mainland of Japan and back and forth. And he said that just about every morning before he was about to embark on his flight back to Japan, there would be a knock at his door, and he could never figure it out. But then later he believed that it was a spirit of a Japanese soldier who wanted to be liberated back to the mainland, who died on this island and wanted to go back home. And so since then, every time he would go on this flight to go back to Japan, he would open the door and say, "Come on, if you want to go, I'm going to be leaving. Come with me," and tries to get them to come along. I think it's a great story. It gives me goosebumps even right now to think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Almost a little eerie.
Yeah.
Now, you've written all these different ghost stories, whether it's about music legends, World War II, haunted rails, country music. What has been the most interesting or what you've enjoyed writing about the most?
I always go back. I think there's a lot of good ones in every single one. I don't think there's any individual story I think that stands out as better than any of the other ones. But what I think I really like about this and really like about these volumes is it's really given me a sense of just how important the spiritual side is. And it's given me a sense of meaning. And so, I write, I'm a research writer, so I write about science and I don't know how my colleagues feel about me writing about the supernatural. I'm sure they've got some choice words for it, but I've learned that these two things, science and spirituality, can be complementary. I think science, you mentioned, and I'm sure as a researcher yourself, when you go in there, you want the facts, you want the numbers, you want the temperature shifts and all of those things. And I think that's important. But the other important thing is when science gives us the facts, it doesn't necessarily give us meaning. So if you're in there and you're quantitatively documenting what you're experiencing, there was, temperatures dropped rapidly, your EMF reader went haywire, and you're writing all this down, that still probably doesn't say as much as how you feel when you were on the USS Arizona Memorial. Those are the things that how these two things blend. So that's really important for me. So if I would say one volume that I really enjoyed doing, it was the Haunted Rock and Roll and the Ghosts of Country Music. I love music so much, and I think it's so important. But the other thing is these books and the writing process have tied up a lot of loose ends for me, because now I don't look at music the same way that I did before. I realize now that there is something special about music that can change our consciousness. And likewise, now I don't think I'll ever look at railroad history as this kind of, boring, well, we took a load of coal, 500 miles to Harrisburg and, those sorts of things. I really think that there's something special about history of all different sorts. And I really think that these ghost stories, writing these ghost stories, have provided me a gateway into understanding these maybe on a different level.
Yeah, and again, thank you so much for sharing these stories. Fascinating stuff. And do you have any other books you're planning on writing about the subject of hauntings or ghosts? Anything on the horizon related to that?
I have some ideas. I do think I want to revisit something in the realm of haunted music, maybe the blues, maybe some folklore, some ghost stories about the blues and jazz. I think there might be some material there. I'm actually thinking of some mafia stuff too. So, who knows? I don't have anything down. I just start the process by thinking about it and then going out and trying to find whether I can get some stories are out there. I'll start going online and see if there's anything out there, people I can talk to. So that's kind of where I'm at now.
Interesting. Well, Matthew, once again, thank you for joining me. Real quick, where can people go to find your work?
Yeah, you can probably find most of the books. All the books will be on Amazon.com. Some of them are on BarnesandNoble.com. If you have a favorite bookseller and you don't see the book there, just ask them to bring it in. I also have a website, probably not the greatest updated website right now, but that's mattswayne.com, MATTSWAYNE.
Okay. All right. Well, once again, thank you for joining me, Matthew. It was a pleasure to have you back on the show. And stay safe out there. There's kind of crazy times going on. And hopefully we can talk again, maybe down the road a ways.
I would really like that. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on the show. And I really appreciate your interest in this.
All right. Have a great night.
You too.